Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. We are here for case number 9490, Potomac Edison rate case hearing. Are there any preliminary matters this morning?
Yes, Your Honor. We have, as promised, responses to both of your bench data requests. I can distribute them now. The second one that I will distribute contains confidential electric infrastructure information, so we would ask that it be received and kept under seal.
Have the other parties reviewed the response yet?
No, I'm going to distribute them now.
Please, thank you. Okay, what I'd like to do is mark these Commission Exhibit 1 and Commission Exhibit 2C, and we'll review them and make a determination about their admissibility after we take a break. Okay, any other preliminary matters?
No.
Hearing none, I believe Mr. Fields.
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. The Office of People's Counsel calls Peter J. Lanzolata.
I do.
Morning, Mr. Lanzolata.
Good morning.
Could you state your name for the record, spelling your last name, and provide your business address, please?
Peter J. Lanzolata, Lanzalotta, 67 Royal Point Drive, Hilton Head Island, South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Lanzolata. Do you have before you a document entitled Direct Testimony of Peter J. Lanzolata on behalf of the Maryland Office of People's Counsel dated November 27th, 2018?
I do.
Does that document contain 16 pages of questions and answers, 5 exhibits, and a collection of data responses?
Yes.
And, Your Honor, I would like to point out for the record, one of these data responses, 8.6.
Is that in the rebuttal testimony?
No, this is in the direct.
In the direct.
Yeah, attached to the direct. It's the second to last data response. It has a marking at the top, protected material provided pursuant to protective order contains critical energy infrastructure information, CEI, I do not release. That mark relates to the 2 attachments that are referenced in the answer. It does not relate to the answer itself. We have not included the attachments and don't intend to, but that did cause some confusion, and I wanted to state for the record that We've reviewed it. We reviewed it again with the company this morning, and this answer does not provide any CEII information.
I can confirm that, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for clearing that up, Mr. Fields.
All right, thank you. Mr. Lanzolata, did you prepare this testimony under yourself or under your direct supervision?
Yes.
Do you have any corrections to this testimony you'd like to present?
No.
All right. Your Honor, I'd like to mark this exhibit as OPC Exhibit 26.
So marked.
Mr. Lanzolata, if I ask you these questions today, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
Thank you. Do you also have in front of you a document entitled Rebuttal Testimony of Peter J. Lanzolata on behalf of the Maryland Office of People's Counsel, dated December 20th, 2018?
Yes.
And that document consists of 5 pages of question and answers, correct?
Correct.
Was this document produced by you or under your direct supervision?
Yes.
Do you have any corrections to this testimony at this time?
No.
And if I ask you these questions again under oath today, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'd like to mark this testimony as OPC Exhibit 27.
So marked.
And Mr. Lanzolata, finally, do you have in front of you a document entitled Surrebuttal Testimony and Exhibits of Peter Lanzolata on behalf of Office of People's Counsel, dated January 16, 2019?
Yes.
Does this document contain 6 pages of question and answers?
Yes.
Do you have any corrections to this document you'd like to present to the Commission?
One correction. Page 4, line 4. The 6th word is supposed to be of. It's listed here as PF. That's the only correction.
All right, thank you. With that correction, if I ask you these questions again today, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'd like to mark this exhibit as OPC 28.
So marked.
And Your Honor, OPC moves for the admission of OPC Exhibits 26, 27, and 28.
No objection.
They are admitted.
Thank you. Mr. Lanzolata is available for cross-examination.
Mr. Trout.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Mr. Lanzolata.
Good morning, Mr. Trout.
Could you take out your rebuttal testimony and turn to page 4?
I'm there.
Thank you. Specifically, could you look at the last full sentence on that page?
I see it.
Okay. And in that sentence, you state that Potomac Edison is, quote, one of the least efficient Maryland companies at achieving additional safety improvements. Is that correct?
That's what it says, yes.
Okay. And that is what you're testifying to, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Okay. But didn't you help prepare comments for OPC just 6 months ago where OPC asserted that by a different measure, Potomac Edison was the most efficient of the Maryland electric utilities?
That's entirely possible.
Okay. Do you remember those comments?
Not the specific comment.
Well, would you mind if I refresh your recollection?
Please do.
Okay. At this point, it's not my intention to offer this document as an exhibit, but rather just to use it to refresh the witness's recollection.
Okay.
Do you want copies or not?
Yes, we'll take a look. Follow along.
But they're not being marked.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, did I not do a copy? So, Mr. Lancelot, what I've handed you to review for the purposes of refreshing your recollection is the cover page, the first page, and then the 25th page of a set of comments that were filed by the Office of People's Counsel in the reliability docket, case 9353, in July of 2018. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. And if you look at the second page of what I handed you, there's a footnote 3, which talks about your role in the preparation of those that set of comments. You see
Yes.
that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And you remember, in fact, helping to prepare these comments.
Yes.
Okay. And then could you turn to page the page 25, which is the third page of what I just handed you, and you'll see there's a table, and then the second sentence there talks about the various different reliability-related O&M expense per customer ranges of the different Maryland electric utilities. You see that?
Yes, I do.
And did you help prepare that table?
I'm sure I did.
Okay. And per the table and as explained in the sentence we just directed your attention to, it says Potomac Edison has the lowest expense per customer in 2017 for reliability-related O&M expense.
Yes, for O&M expenses.
Okay. So, okay, fair enough. Moving to another topic, let's go to your surrebuttal testimony, if we could, for a moment. And go to page 2, if you would.
Okay.
All right. And specifically, could you go to the answer that begins on line 9?
Okay.
All right. And there you testify, quote, Mr. Lanzalotta sees little value in using a planning margin so large that the company is assured of always meeting future reliability standards. You see that?
Yes.
So first of all, I'm assuming that the Mr. Lanzalotta there that you're referring to in your testimony is yourself.
Yes, sir.
Okay, you're just using the third person. Okay. And then companies capitalized, so I assume that in that sentence you intended to refer specifically to Potomac Edison?
In this particular case, yes, although sentence would have been as accurate if I'd had a little C there as well.
Okay.
That particular thought's not directed just at Potomac Edison, but at utilities in general.
Fair enough. Do you remember answering some data requests, including one data request recently with respect to that specific sentence in your testimony?
Yes.
Okay. And do you recall confirming that Potomac Edison's planning margin is not so large as to trigger the concern you articulate here?
That's correct.
Okay. I will mark this one, Your Honor. Your Honor, I'd like to mark the document that I've just handed to the witness as Company Exhibit 41. And is this the data request response that we were just discussing a moment ago?
Yes.
Okay. So again, here you confirm that the company's current planning margin does not cause you concern.
Correct.
And don't you also confirm in this same data request response that even if the EDIS programs are adopted, Potomac Edison's planning margin will still not be so large as to cause you concern?
I say in my testimony that, in general, OPC and the comments that I helped prepare support standards that the company might statistically have a chance to fail once or twice a decade. With the EDIS, the company has a chance of failing to meet the reliability standard, a 6.7 chance once every 15 years. So it's not in the 10-year range that we would feel the most comfortable with. We probably feel more comfortable with that than with what's addressed in item C here in the response, which is standards set such that there's statistically improbable that they would ever not be met.
Okay, good. Well, you anticipated my next question. Thank you. So it's your testimony that even if the EDIS is adopted, the Potomac Edison's planning margin is still going to be lower than that of BGE, Pepco, and Delmarva.
If we assume that the commission is going to approve staff's recommendations in that regard, I wasn't aware that any decision on that had been reached.
I also am unaware of any decision having been reached, so that's a safe assumption to make. All right. If you don't mind, I'm going to deviate from practice of the other counsel, and I'm going to offer my exhibits as I go along. I'd like to offer Exhibit 41 into evidence.
No objection.
It's admitted.
So, you've told us that the current planning margin of Potomac Edison is not, quote, so large that the company is always assured of meeting future reliability standards, correct?
Yes.
And you've told us that if the EDIS is adopted, the company's planning margin will still not be, quote, so large that the company is assured of always meeting future reliability standards, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Then why did you have this sentence in your testimony directed at the company because the company is capitalized?
My testimony refers to a statement by Mr. McGetton in his rebuttal testimony, where at least my impression was that Mr. McGetton suggests the proper use of planning margins is to ensure that the company will continuously meet future reliability goals. There's Mr. McGettigan's testimony. That's what prompted this line of thought.
Okay, thank you. I understand. One last question on this topic then. Would you agree that if Potomac Edison has the lowest planning margin of the 4 investor-owned electric utilities, it accordingly has the highest risk of failing the reliability standards, all else being equal?
I agree.
Thank you. The next set of questions I'd like to ask you, Mr. Lancelotta, relate to your specific testimony concerning the 4 specific EDIS programs. And if it's all right with you, I'd like to march through them sort of one by one, starting with the tree trimming proposal. Are you recommending to the Commission that Potomac Edison should not switch to a 4-year tree trimming cycle?
No, I'm not.
Okay. And with respect to the recloser program, are you recommending to the Commission that Potomac Edison should not implement the recloser program described in Mr. McGettigan's testimony?
No, that's not my testimony.
Okay. In fact, do you recall answering a data request where we asked you if you had any specific criticisms of the recloser program, and you said you did not?
I remember.
Okay. Thank you. Looking at I always get this wrong, distribution automation, or DA, program, could we look specifically at your rebuttal testimony?
I've got it.
Okay. Page 5, let's find the lines. Sort of in the middle of the page, there's a paragraph that begins on line 6, these numbers, and it ends with the quote, the basis for Mr. Lancelotta's concerns. You see that paragraph?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So you did an analysis of what you're characterizing as outage duration performance, and you have concluded that that analysis causes you concerns about the DA proposal. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. I am going to show you 2 documents that are already in evidence as Potomac Edison or exhibits 14 and 15. So we don't have to remark these or anything, they're already in it.
Thank you.
So could you look, please, at the document that's marked in its upper right-hand corner as Potomac Edison Exhibit number 14?
Okay?
All right. And that's a data request provided by the company to the Office of People's Counsel and sponsored by Mr. McGettigan. And it concerns the DA program, right?
Yes.
All right. Did you review that document after it was received and before you filed your rebuttal testimony?
Yes.
Okay. You did not reference this document or the data contained in it in your rebuttal testimony, however, did you?
No, I did not.
Okay. And then, could you look at the document that is labeled Potomac Edison Exhibit number 15?
Yes.
Okay. Now, this is a portion of a company response to an attachment to a company response to a staff data request. See that?
Yes.
Okay. Do you remember responding to a data request from the company as to whether this was also a document that you reviewed?
Yes.
And your response was yes, you had reviewed this document?
Yes.
Okay. Well, we don't need to use that. But again, this document and this data is not referenced by you in your discussion of the DA scheme in your rebuttal testimony, is it?
It is not.
Lastly, let's talk about the underground cable replacement program. And for that, we can stay on your rebuttal. I think we're at the bottom of page 2 and the top of page 3. You talk about the underground cable replacement program. Is that right? Is that where you discuss it?
Yes.
Okay. So, again, I'd like to get a little more clarity as to what your recommendation to the Commission is and is not. Are you recommending to the Commission that the company just leave the unjacketed underground cable in place until each piece fails?
I was recommended they continue their reactive program. Yes, and they wait until a cable is beginning to show reliability problems, and then they go in to try to address that, rather than addressing cables that are operating just fine at the present,
So wait until it fails.
in essence.
Okay. Thank you. All right, final line of questions, Mr. Blancelot, and I appreciate the brevity and clarity of the answers you've been giving. You would agree, wouldn't you, that the Commission would have more control over the scope of the EDIS programs if the company were required to file annual reports and there were annual hearings on the programs, as opposed to the company just going ahead and implementing the programs and them not being reviewed until the company files its next base rate case?
Well, the Commission would certainly have more information if they were making these regular reports on these 4 programs.
And if the process were such that the company had to not only report on what it did the last year, but also propose what it was going to do in the following year, the Commission would have more control as well, wouldn't it? I
agree, they certainly have more information.
Okay. Would you agree that the commission would have more control over we were talking about the scope of the programs. Would you agree that the commission would have more control over the cost of the programs if there was an annual reporting and hearing mechanism as opposed to just waiting for the next base rate case?
Your Honor, I object. I believe that calls for a legal conclusion as to the Commission's regulatory authority.
I'm going to allow the question, Mr. Fields.
Again, they would have more information as to the costs and all with those reports.
As they were going along each year, they would have more information.
Yes.
Okay. So we've talked about control over the scope and over the cost. Same question. Would you agree that the commission would have more control over the effectiveness of the programs if the company had to come in and have an annual hearing on each of the programs?
Same objection, Your Honor.
Overruled.
The effectiveness of these programs is not really going to be known when the company does the work and files these reports. It's not really until after that that the effectiveness begins to become more clear. So I'm not even sure that the regular annual reports would help as much in keeping them appraised as to the effectiveness of these programs as it would keep them appraised of the cost or the progress of these programs.
Thank you. Finally, would you agree that the company is likely to be more efficient, be able to be more efficient in designing and implementing reliability programs like those in the EDIS proposal if the company is able to plan them out in advance rather than waiting to react to a crisis?
I guess where possible, it's always preferable to try to plan things out in advance rather than react to a crisis. I'm not sure you always have the luxury of knowing that there's an impending crisis, but all else equal, I think it's better to have a plan where possible. I don't see where having or not having the EDIS forecloses the company from having a particular type of plan. I'm finished.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's all I have, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Trout. Mr. Dean?
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Mr. Lanzalotta.
Good morning, Mr. Dean.
Although you don't designate it by anything after your name, you're a professional engineer, isn't that correct?
I'm registered in Maryland and Connecticut, yes.
Thank you. Turning to your direct testimony, your exhibit PLJ-5.
Okay.
And this is a table discussing DA circuits and SAFE and SADI values associated with those circuits. Now you have two columns for each of these, which are labeled, as I understand, without exclusions and with exclusions.
Okay, it took me a moment. I had gone to the wrong exhibit at first. Yes, I've got that here. Without exclusions and with exclusions.
Which, what do you mean by exclusions?
A major event.
And could you explain what you want the commissioners to, what information you want the commissioners to get from your inclusion of this exhibit?
This exhibit, of course, has three parts. The top part, the distribution automation feeders. This is data on 2 feeders that had distribution automation installed, I believe it was in 2016. So the data on the top third gives you combined SAFE and SADE with and without exclusions for those 2 distribution automation feeders. The middle part, where it says system, these are SAFE and SADE for Potomac Edison's entire system, with and without exclusions. And as I say in my testimony, reason I include this element here is so that any changes in performance on the feeders that have distribution automation installed can be judged from the background as to whether the entire system is getting more reliable or less reliable during that period. If the entire system is getting more reliable, I'm going to assume that the 2 feeders that have the distribution automation would, all else being equal, have gotten more reliable along with the rest of the system. A lot of times the system reliability is driven by factors such as weather that most of the feeders experience. In the bottom third of this exhibit, there's a ratio between the values for the distribution feeders and the values for the entire system. If this bottom third was full of all 1.00s, then we would know that the SADE and the SAFE for our 2 distribution automation feeders was exactly the same as for the entire system. So when I go to this bottom part and we look at SAFE for 2017, 0.97, say that the SAFE on the distribution automation feeders was lower than or better than the SAFE on the entire system. Whereas we go over to SADE for 2017, we see 1.98, 1.99. We know that the SADE on those distribution feeders was close to twice what it was for the SADE on the entire system. And we could see, going back again on this bottom third, if we look at 2015 as opposed to 2017, 2015, the SAFE on our distribution automation feeders was, well, 1.75 times what it was on the entire system. So they were considerably higher SAFEs. When we go down to after the distribution automation, the SAFEs are at 0.97, so they have been improved from being considerably worse than the entire system to being better than the entire system in that year. While SADE, was at 1.88 in 2015, again worse than the entire system. After the distribution automation was installed in 2016 and 2017, the SADEs were even higher compared to the total system. So the SAIDIs had moved in a counterintuitive direction. You would hope that they would have gotten better, but for these two feeders under these conditions, they got worse. That was the root of my concerns about the distribution feeders.
Thank you. Now turning to your rebuttal testimony on page 4.
Yes?
Referring to footnote number 2,
Yes.
could you tell me what the significance that you place on the statement that the company's current safety is already less than 1.00?
Certainly. 1.00 is a safety of one interruption per customer per year. Safeties that are lower than 1.00 reflect even more reliable performance. In general, the better the reliability of your system, the more expensive it is to improve that reliability. Point of diminishing returns. If you got a very unreliable system, the first increments of reliability improvement may be quite a bit less expensive. But as reliability of the system gets better and better, typically gets more and more expensive to improve that reliability further. And that's what I'm referring to here.
Okay, thank you. Now, in the company's cross-examination of you, you answered a few questions on the Comar limit per SAIDI and SAFE. What significance is there for an electric company if it fails to meet the Comar specified SAIDI or SAFE values?
Do you mean what's the next step? What happens as a
Yes.
result?
Yes.
The company's required to file a corrective action plan to address that shortfall.
And can the requirement to file a corrective action plan be in itself costly to a company?
To file it and implement it,
Yes.
yeah, it'll cost money.
Thank you. Lastly, I'd like to go to your rebuttal testimony on page 5, the last question and answer there.
I'm there.
Prior to your rebuttal testimony, your testimony tended to state that you were providing commentary on the company's request for reliability improvements. Isn't that correct?
Is this something I should go back and check my direct testimony on? Or?
Only if you wish to. Let me add to the question, and it's not until your rebuttal testimony that you have a specific recommendation. Is that correct?
I'm not sure I was aware of that. I thought I had a recommendation on my direct testimony as well. On page 3 of my direct, I conclude that the company's current electric service reliability performance is more reliable than required by Comar reliability standards through the year 2019 and is more reliable than proposed standards through the year 2023. Given the reliability, the relatively low probability of the company's failing to meet one of the annual reliability standards, and given the high satisfaction levels of the company's residential customers with the company's electric service reliability, I conclude that new incremental reliability spending programs, such as reflected in the proposed electric distribution investment surcharge, are not required.
Thank you for correcting me on that. Is it specifically, is it your recommendation that the company should not perform the increased reliability work that it's proposing, or is it your testimony that the company should not recover through a surcharge the costs of performing this work?
Well, as far as the second one goes, I conclude they don't need the surcharge mechanism. As far as the first question, each one of these programs can help reliability. The question is, do we want to do it via a surcharge? Is it, something where it's a real emergency, something that needs badly to be addressed, or are these reliability improvements that, if the price is reasonable, they would probably have no problem in a rate case.
Okay, thank you. Staff has no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Dean. Can you redirect, Mr. Dean?
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Lanzalotta, do you still have somewhere in front of you the photocopy of the excerpt of the July 19, 2018 Office of People's Counsel comments?
Yes, I do.
Your Honor, I'm going to ask a couple questions about this, and I'd like to mark that as OPC Exhibit 19.
Any objections? Oh, well, we're only marking it. Sorry.
Marking, yes.
OPC 19. So marked. Oh, I'm sorry. I have 29.
Oh, yes, 29 is what I meant to say, 29.
Okay.
And the questions regarding this document, Mr. Lanzalotta, I believe referred to your rebuttal testimony, page 4, and the table C that's in the middle of that page. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And could you explain for us how there could be one relationship, the relationship of dollars per safety improvement that's shown in Table C might be different than the relationship among companies of the O&M dollars per customer spend, if you could?
Sure. Table C is looking at the cost of implementing reliability improvements. Other than segments of veg management, a lot of that's going to be capital investment. And it's not going to be an O&M expense. In fact, you might almost say that the more they spend on installing the improvement, the less their O&M expense could be going on into the future from those improvements.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lanzalotta. You also discussed with Mr. Trout, looking at Surrebuttal page 2, discussing planning margin, the sentence regarding planning margin so large that the company is assured of always meeting future reliability standards.
Yes?
What is your concern with companies using a high planning margin?
Costs more. The higher the planning margin, the more reliability-related work you're going to be doing, and the more expensive it's going to be for customers in general.
Thank you, Mr. Lenslat. I have no further questions. I move to admit OPC Exhibit 29.
Your Honor, if it's being offered as an expression of OPC's concerns, I have no objection.
All right, it'll be admitted. Good morning, Mr. Lanzalotta.
Good morning.
So, with respect to your testimony about the efficiency of Potomac Edison as related to other companies, would that efficiency number be impacted by the number of customers, say, on a feeder?
It could be affected by the number of customers, how many customers are on each feeder, how densely these customers are located, things such as that.
Right, and if the terrain were mountainous or more difficult, would that than say an urban? I mean, not to say that urban terrain doesn't have its own
Sure.
challenges, but would that also have potential impact on efficiency?
Yes, that would tend to increase costs.
Right. So would we not potentially expect that Potomac Edison might have a lower efficiency due to fewer customers than say, higher populated areas and some challenging terrain?
That's correct. I'd like to add, I didn't include the section on efficiency to be an indictment of the company. It was more to guide us in whether or not it was whether we wanted them to be spending more money on reliability when they're already meeting the targets and the goals. So we would realize that in terms of some of the other companies spending additional money or Potomac Edison spending additional money, because of those factors and characteristics, they're going to get less bang for the buck for spending a certain amount of money than will some of the other companies.
Right. Okay, thanks. You talked in your testimony with Mr. Dean, I think it's PLJ5 in your direct testimony,
Yes,
this chart, and you were comparing, I believe it was 2 feeders with distribution automation versus the system. Is that, did I get that right?
yes.
Okay. So if one of those feeders hypothetically had a truck run into a pole and knock it down and, have some issues where it took a while to get it back up again, that would have a significant impact on these numbers, would it not, since you're only comparing 2 feeders against the system average?
Yes, it would have significant impact.
Okay. And do you know whether any of these feeders had that kind of incident on them?
I know from listening to Mr. McGettigan on the stand that the reason that the SAIDI went up was that they did have a problem. I don't know if it was a truck or a tree coming down and taking a
Right.
tap down, but it was a tap that was not looped in. It didn't have a connection on the back side with another feeder, so that they could cut clear the area where the tree was and then close those taps and re-energize re-energize the feeder from the backside, so to speak.
Right. So it's likely that these numbers, have some, have been impacted potentially significantly by that particular event that Mr. McGannigan described. Is that right?
It sounded like a fairly substantial outage, and like you pointed out, it was on one feeder. So.
Right. One of the feeders that you include in here.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks. Do you have an opinion on whether a program like the EDIS should include O&M versus capital expenses?
I hadn't given that any thought at all.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Okay. Do you think, I want to go back to some of the cross-examination that Mr. Trout had done, that, we have this unjacketed cable that I think, well, let me start with this question. Do you think there are reliability concerns with unjacketed cable?
Yes, there are industry concerns about service life.
Right.
Of that cable.
And do you think but it's your position that Potomac Edison should not proactively replace it, even unknowing about all of those, industry concerns with respect to unjacketed cable? It's your position that the company shouldn't replace that unjacketed cable until it fails?
Well, it's more expensive to replace something before it fails. But if you look, I looked first at the company's history over the past 4 or 5 years with cables, and they say the number of failures are increasing. It's true, in 2017 the number went up infinitesimally. They have a graph I don't know if it's with somebody's testimony, but when they show the graph going across failures per year, they were all in the vicinity of, around 4,000. They didn't show any clear upward trend, and certainly not a trend that was, going up like this. Then I looked at customer minutes of interruption from underground equipment failure, and I expect most of that to be from these types of cables. And between 2016 and 2017, those customer interruption minutes decreased. And they decreased by a significant amount. I think it was over 30%. So the annual number of failures are increasing maybe a little. The effects on customers over the past year have shown a fairly sharp decrease. The company is handling those failures that they're coming up with, a lot more efficiently than say they were before. So I was reluctant to say, yeah, we should go ahead and start replacing good cable now before it fails, so that we can avoid these outages in the future. The effects have been not increasing sharply. The customer interruption minutes have been decreasing. And so I, maybe a few years down the road, if these things start, showing an increase, I could see some justification, but I didn't in this case.
Okay. Would it give you greater comfort with a program like this if there were a sunset after 4 or 5 years?
Cable replacement, well,
or the entire, any of the
the
EDIS
entire
type
program.
Yeah.
It might be less of a concern, but my criticisms of it were not so much that the program was never ending. It was what the program was addressing.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Lanzolata. Commissioner Richard.
Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
Let's see, I don't want to repeat the questions. Let me think here. So on the cable replacement, the underground cable replacement, you don't believe at this point that there is significant consequence to customers to move forward with a proactive program, that the reactive program is sufficient. Is that basically the answer, Commissioner Herman's question?
So far,
Okay.
to my way of thinking, the reactive program is sufficient.
Okay. And just looking at all four of the EDIS programs, do I understand your testimony to be that overall you support them? They are a good idea to have the reclosures, the distribution automation, accelerating the tree trimming, the vegetation management. You just don't believe we should do it with a surcharge.
That's my testimony.
Okay,
yes.
so if they were to do this and come back for a rate case, you'd be fine going through a traditional rate-making proceeding for the company to seek recovery for these types of programs?
I certainly would have a lot fewer problems than I do with it as a surcharge. You say on the distribution automation, surcharge or no, we'd like to see reliability results from that. And if they go into a rate case and they've done it and they put it in and everything, and so we would look at that.
Okay.
But as far as replacing the reclosers, it's generally a good idea for reliability improvement,
Okay.
but just not through the surcharge.
Okay, and you heard our commission staff has said they believe it is in the public interest, and you're aware, I'm sure, of Maryland kind of history that has, our legislature, our governors have put a high premium on reliability. If the company were not incentivized or likely to carry out these four programs without a surcharge mechanism, like we've, similar to what we've done for Pepco and for BG in the past, I mean, does that sway you at all, or do you still believe that given that background, that we should deny a surcharge approach?
If you look at the company's reliability performance, they've generally been, they have missed a standard or two in the last 5 years. Most of them have been for specific reasons and addressable reasons, and reasons the company went out and then subsequently addressed. If company's reliability needed a big shot of improvement, if we were unhappy with where they were versus the COMAR standards, if we weren't comfortable with where the COMAR standards were, we were still shooting for first quartile or something along those lines, that would be different. This company, a lot of what I heard was that the other companies were getting these huge planning margins. Why not them? From the case they're setting these reliability standards going forward. And I'm not sure I have an answer to that, but given their reliability and where they are, no, I don't support a surcharge.
Okay. Well, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Lanzalata, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
I wanted to explore a little bit, excuse me, this notion of reaching the point of diminishing returns. I've had a concern about that in other programs, Empower, maybe some projects. How do you know? How do you know? Because it seems to me, in this instance, to be very imprecise. Your opinion is they reach the point of diminishing returns and go beyond, but the company's is different and the staff's is different opinions. But how does the commissioner know? How does the commission know when that point of diminishing returns is reached precisely? It seems more like art than science.
I have to agree with you to a large extent. We throw around these efficiency numbers, dollars per unit of safety, and things like that. And that lets us know when we're having to spend more to achieve a unit of improvement on safety. But how much is that unit of improvement in safety really worth? to customers and everything. That is a really imprecise area. And a lot of discussion over that. Excuse me. My cold decided to make the trip with me. There is no hard and fast way to know. Over time, I've been working with People's Counsel for quite a long time, and you look at this reliability year after year after year, you maybe get a better feel. It's costing a company, really a lot more to implement a reliability improvement. That should raise the question, where have we reached a point of diminishing returns?
Let me ask you this way.
Okay.
In certain projects, say transmission projects, generally, they have to meet a certain threshold of benefit to cost ratio, right? So there's appropriate margin in there for cost overruns and other things. So if you go below a certain benefit to cost ratio, the project isn't approved to go forward.
It's PJM's market efficiency program, yes.
But we don't have anything like that here in this reliability program or in other areas, to be honest with you. Should we consider developing a set of thresholds that set a cost to benefit ratio on these reliability improvement costs?
It'd be terrific
Is it possible?
if we could, and if we felt comfortable with it and it didn't cost a fortune. I could speak from my experience with the PJM market efficiency program, because we're involved in a big fight with them right now, and
We don't want to talk about that right now.
okay. But the person doing the computation of market efficiency, it's such a complex computation. They have so much control over the computation that you're really not sure where you really are with those numbers. And so the point of diminishing returns is a misnomer, really. It's not a point. It's more of a continuum. And it's where you are in that continuum that you say, okay, enough is enough.
And it may be too difficult then, I surmise you're kind of saying, to develop such a precise system of evaluation.
Well, I'm not all-knowing. I
I'm
haven't seen an approach yet that really fills me with confidence on
I'm
that.
just asking your opinion because you put a lot of your testimony on having gone beyond the point of diminishing returns, so I wanted to see what your thoughts were. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you again, Mr. Lanzalotti, for your testimony.
Thank you.
Mr. Fields.
Yes. Office of People's Counsel calls David Efron. We'll have to shuffle some papers and people.
I do. You probably even find it.
Yeah.
Yes, I do.
Good morning, Mr. Efron. Would you kindly state your name for the record?
Yes, yes. David J. Efron, E-F-F-R-O-N.
Would you please state the name of your business and its address?
I'm self-employed, doing business as Berkshire Consulting Services, 12 Pond Path, Northampton, New Hampshire.
Thank you. Do you have before you a document entitled Revised Direct Testimony of David J. Efron, which was filed in this case on December 6th, 2018?
Yes, I do.
And does that document include 28 pages of narrative testimony, your CV labeled Appendix 1, Exhibit DJE-1R, which contains your schedules, and 10 data responses by the company to data requests?
Yes, it does.
Your Honor, I would like to have Mr. Efron's pre-filed revised direct testimony marked for identification as OPC Exhibit 30.
So marked.
Mr. Efron, do you also have before you a document entitled Surrebuttal Testimony of David J. Efron, which was filed in this case on January 16, 2019?
Yes, I do.
And does that document include 13 pages of narrative testimony and Exhibit DJE-2, which contains your schedules?
Yes, it does.
Thank you. Your Honor, I would like to have Mr. Efron's pre-filed surrebuttal testimony marked for identification as OPC Exhibit 31.
So marked.
Mr. Efron, were all of these documents before you, prepared by you, or under your supervision and direction?
Yes, they were.
Do you have any corrections or deletions to make to your respective testimonies at this time?
I do not.
If you were asked the same questions today under oath as were posed in your pre-filed testimonies, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
And for these reasons, do you adopt these direct and surrebuttal testimonies respectively as your sworn testimony in this matter?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Your Honor, I move that OPC Exhibit numbers 30 and 31 be admitted into evidence.
No objection.
They are admitted.
Your Honor, the witness is now available for cross-examination.
Thank you, Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Gunderson.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Mr. Efron.
Good morning.
My name is Chris Gunderson. I represent Potomac Edison in this case, and I'll be asking you a few questions today. First, I'd just like you to authenticate a handful of data request responses, so I'll hand those up to you.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Efron, we've handed you a packet of data request responses, which are all responses sponsored by you, and they are in response to PE 3-1, PE 4-6, 4-7, 4-8, 4-9, 4-10, and 4-11. Just take a moment to take a look through those. And Your Honor, may we please have this packet of DR responses marked as Potomac Edison Exhibit 42?
Yes, you're marking it as a single packet.
Yes.
So marked.
Thank you. And Mr. Robin, I'd just like to ask you, after you're finished reviewing them, just to confirm that these are true and accurate copies of the data request responses that are sponsored by you in this case.
Yes, they appear to be accurate copies of the responses that I drafted for Office of Public Counsel.
All right, thank you. Those are the only questions on those, so you can just put those aside. Now, in your testimony in this case, you've discussed some proposed modifications to Potomac Edison's post-test year adjustments to rate base for reliability plant. And in particular, I wanted to ask you some questions about capital repairs deductions. And do you recall your testimony on that point?
Yes.
Okay. And I believe you've stated in your testimony that that the company's, let me rephrase. I believe you stated in your testimony that it's your opinion that the capital repairs deduction being set at 0 is not a reasonable assumption. Is that fair?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. I'd like to show you a copy of the IRS revenue procedures for capital repairs deductions, and we'll hand up a copy of that. All right, Mr. Efron, I've handed you a document titled Revenue Procedure 2011-43, which is 26 pages long. And Your Honor, may you please have this document marked as Potomac Edison Exhibit 43.
So marked.
Thank you. Are you familiar with the Revenue Procedures document I just handed you?
I've seen this before.
Okay, thank you. And if you take a look at the first page, Section 1 states the purpose of this document, and just want to confirm you do understand this is the revenue procedures for capital repairs deductions or capital repairs deductions.
As I understand it, as I recall, it's the procedures for implementing the capital repairs deductions.
Right. Okay. Thank you. All right, and then Section 2 goes on, if you look at the first page of the exhibit onto the second page, to state that whether expenditures are deductible as repairs or must be capitalized as improvements depends on whether the expenditures materially increase the value of the property or substantially prolong its useful life. Do you see that?
So what page are we on?
Sure. The first page of the exhibit, the bottom of the first page, you see the sentence that starts with whether these expenditures are deductible as repairs.
Oh, yes, yeah, I see it now, yes.
Okay. And would you agree generally that a capital repair that materially increases the value of the property or substantially prolongs its useful life would not be deductible?
That's the general rule here, yes.
Okay. All right, if you turn to page 4 of Exhibit 43, and this is section 3.03, the section titled Electric Transmission and Distribution Property. Here the revenue procedure identifies electric transmission and distribution property as real and personal property that is used to conduct and control electricity, and so on and so forth. And it gives examples of wires, towers, poles, etc. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. And if you turn to page 6 of the exhibit, just section 5.01, and here the revenue procedure discusses the rule that in the middle of that section, if more than 10% of the unit of linear property is replaced, the cost of the replacement must be capitalized. Do you see that?
Yes, they're discussing here the standards for qualifying for the safe harbor allowance that they describe.
And when it says that a replacement must be capitalized, that means that it cannot be deducted, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And so this is an example of a category of projects that where the capital repairs deduction would be 0, correct?
Where it wouldn't qualify for the so-called safe harbors, what they're describing here. That doesn't mean necessarily it wouldn't be deductible, it just wouldn't qualify for the safe harbor.
Okay. And then if you turn to page 11 of the exhibit, which is, I'll direct you to section 5.06 at the bottom of that page. And this section discusses expenditures that must be capitalized, notwithstanding any other provision in the revenue procedure, correct?
That's what it states.
And the first subpart of section 5.06 talks about the cost of replacing overhead conductor with underground conductor within a circuit, regardless of how many of the conductors are replaced, must be capitalized, correct?
Yes.
And then subpart 3 states that the cost of property that materially increases rated capacity also must be capitalized, correct?
Yes.
So these are also 2 other examples of types of projects that would not qualify for capital repairs deduction, correct?
Correct.
All right, thank you. I'm going to switch gears and direct you to another exhibit. All right, Mr. Efron, I've handed you a document which is the comparison operations revenue requirement positions, which was filed by staff in this case on January 18th, 2019. Do you recognize this document?
Yes.
Okay. Your Honor, may we please mark, well, I'll go on and say that the second page of this exhibit has portions of the comparison chart that I've blown up for ease of reference. And Your Honor, may we please mark this as Potomac Edison Exhibit 44.
It's already in the record of staff exhibit 16.
Oh, okay. Well, in light of the fact that I have the blown up portion, I guess we should mark it as a separate exhibit anyhow. Or we can just mark.
It's identical. I'm not sure why we would need to mark it. It's thank you for the ease of the blow up.
Okay.
And we can just refer to it as staff 16. And, you know, if you're Mr. Spivak, are you comfortable that this is the same numbers blown up?
Let me just check my own. Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, proceed. I don't think we need to mark it. We'll just, but thank you for the larger numbers.
You're welcome. All right, Mr. Efron, I'll direct you to the blown up page. It's easier to read. And the line item called depreciation accrual rates, if you go across, that adjustment results in a reduction in revenue requirement by $24 million and change. Is that correct?
That's the number that's shown here. It would be misleading to say that that's the revenue requirement effect of OPC's proposed adjustment to depreciation accrual rates, though.
Why is that?
Okay, that's because of the convention that the staff used in this exhibit, and I did my best to replicate when I was helping OPC fill this out. If you see the number operating income there in that same line, just to the left of the 24 million, that's a number of 18 million. And in calculating that revenue requirement effect, the total revenue conversion factor, the 1.4 roughly, is applied to that. What's called operating income here, it's not really the operating income effect, it's the expense effect before income taxes. To calculate the full effect of the adjustment to depreciation accrual rates, you would also have to take account of the effect of the increased depreciation expense on the federal income tax expense and the reduction there too. The revenue requirement effect of the OPC depreciation accrual rates is more roughly in the neighborhood of $16 million or so, give or take, which accounts for both the operating income effect and the offsetting increase to rate base effect. Again, it's in the general neighborhood of $16 million.
Okay.
16, yes.
All right, great. Thank you. I have no other questions. I would ask for I would move for the admission of Potomac Edison Exhibits 42 and 43.
Seeing no objection, they are admitted. Mr. Spivak.
Staff has no cross for this witness.
Thank you, Mr. Spivak. Good morning. Oh, I'm sorry, redirect. Sorry, Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Your Honor. Very briefly, Mr. Efron, if I could direct you to what was marked as PE 43, which is the capital expenditures and the procedure set forth in there, a document that Mr. Gunderson had asked you about.
Yes.
If you would, just so the record is clear, well, let me back up. You were asked about this document in connection with your adjustments based on the capital repairs deductions, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And if you would, could you explain to the Commission the capital repairs deductions and taking them into account in the calculation of ADIT related to reliability plant and how this document relates to your adjustment in that regard, if at all?
Yes. In effect, the Internal Revenue Code and the applicable IRS regulations allows utilities and other corporate taxpayers to deduct certain expenditures that are treated as capital expenditures on their books of account and their financial reporting, but are deductible as repairs for federal income tax purposes. The document that I was handed, the IRS regulations, identify certain expenditures, capital expenditures, that would not qualify as repair deductions. Now, in doing my calculation, I made no assumption that all of the reliability expenditures would be deductibles as repairs for income tax purposes. I assumed rough 26.4% based on the company's experience of the additions, capital additions, would be deductible as repairs for income tax purposes. So in effect, I looked at it from the other perspective. I assumed that roughly 3/4 of those expenditures would not in fact be deductible for income tax purposes, and I haven't seen anything in the regulations that would indicate that that's an unreasonable assumption.
And Mr. Efron, why were you required to make that assumption?
Well, we asked the company what the repair allowance would be, and the company said, well, they didn't know. That's not the same as saying it's zero. So I looked at what the actual experience had been in the last 3 years for all of the distribution plant additions, and used the 26%. And after the company's rebuttal testimony, I think I inquired of the company, well, could they identify how much of what they've characterized as reliability additions would qualify for the repairs, and again, they couldn't quantify it. So I continue to assume that 26.4% is a reasonable estimate based on the experience.
Thank you, Mr. Efron. No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Cleaver. Good morning, Mr. Efron.
Good morning.
For your testimony. With respect to that 26.4% number based on prior 3 years, I believe you just said,
Yes.
is that a consistent number with what other with respect to when you've testified in other cases? Is that a number that falls into the general range as related to other companies?
I would say it's within the general range of reasonableness. Some companies, it's higher. It has been higher in certain years. For other companies, it might have been a little bit lower, but I'd say it's within the general range of reasonableness. Yes.
And is that particular adjustment something that is customarily identifiable and identifiable, with other companies?
It's identifiable after the fact. So after the company files its tax returns, it'll know how much of what they treated as capital expenditures and capitalized on their books for financial reporting purposes were deductible as repairs after the fact.
Right. And
Yeah.
for purposes of litigation, is this something that you frequently end up disagreeing with the company about in other cases?
I wouldn't say frequently, no. It's come up as issues in other cases, certainly, but I wouldn't say frequently, but there have been cases where it's come up.
Okay. Mr. Efron, I have to say I had a little bit of trouble trying to understand the disagreement on the prepaid taxes. So I understand that you're arguing that you believe that there's a double counting with respect to prepaid taxes, right?
In effect.
And that the company says that you can't count it because it's already taken into account in the lead lag study.
That's what I'm saying.
That's what you're saying,
Yeah.
and they're saying it's not.
Yeah.
So, can you help me out? Because I have to tell you, this one is, I read it several times, and I had a hard time understanding your position in comparison to Mr. Adams.
Okay. If you look at Mr. Adams' testimony, his exhibits, where he, and I think I have a copy of it here in front of me.
Which exhibit number?
Yeah, I'm getting that out.
Oh, okay.
It's the exhibits where he does the cash working capital requirement and the lead lag study. Let's see. What I have in front of me is JLA 5-5 actual.
I have two 5-5s. Continuation of 5-5. Okay, 5-5.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, it's 5-5 actual. And for example, if you go to line 4 there's an item for other income taxes, Maryland property.
Okay.
The Maryland distribution expense is $10.2 million. The leads and lags, there's a lag of negative 54.83 days.
Wait a minute.
I'm sorry.
Line 4. I'm on 5-5.
Actual.
Actual. Again, I don't see anything. I see 12.1.
Oh, you have to go over to the right-hand columns, the 3 right-hand columns.
3 right-hand columns. I see 592, 554.83, 325.
Okay. The 54.83 there that you just, okay, that's in parentheses?
Yes.
Okay. The way the convention here works in the lead lag study, that indicates a payment in advance of 54.83 days.
Okay.
A payment in advance of the expense being realized, that's what a prepayment is.
Okay.
And the company has recognized that payment in advance or prepayment in the lead lag study right here. And it substantially increases the cash working capital requirement. I don't have the number in front of me, but as I recall, it was something by over $1 million by including that one item alone in the cash working capital calculation, with that 54.83 negative payment lag, whatever you want to call it, or negative payment lead, but it's 54.83 days. That's the average that's the average number of days by which this expense is prepaid.
Okay.
All right. And now, if you went to the company's work papers supporting the prepayments, you would see the largest item in there is for the other taxes.
And you're saying that's the same
It's
item as line 4?
It's substantially. It's not exactly the same item. It's substantially the same. It's very similar. Put it that way.
Okay.
Because there are other things that would go in there too. But that's the largest component of it. By including in the lead lag study like this, and then also taking a number off the balance sheet, to me that's improperly mixing in the cash working capital based on the lead lag study with cash working capital requirement using a balance sheet approach. It's almost similar to what if I were looking to lower the cash working capital requirement, I would say, okay, well, the lag in payment for wages and salaries is accounted for in this lead lag study. Then I would look on the balance sheet and I would see that, well, there's also an accrued liability for wages and salaries. Now, I wouldn't say, well, that should be deducted from rate base, because the balance sheet effect of that payment in arrears, if you will, as opposed to the payment in advance we've been talking about, has already been accounted for in the lead lag study, and it would be duplicative to look at the balance sheet, a separate financial statement, and say, well, now I'm also going to make a rate-based deduction for this expense that's been accrued and included in the expenses but not yet paid. It just wouldn't. It's not a proper matching. I'm not aware of other companies having done that for prepaid items such as property taxes or other taxes. If there's some kind of long-term prepayment that stretches out for years, that's a different matter. But in these ongoing expenses that are included and accounted for in the lead lag study, then to me it wouldn't be appropriate to also go and take a number off the balance sheet.
Okay. Thank you very much. I understand it now. I think that's all I had for you. Thank you very much, Mr. Efron. Commissioner Richard.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, those were my questions too. I was still a little bit confused about the prepaid tax item, so I think that question's been answered. Thank you.
I have reviewed your testimonies, Mr. Efron, and I have no questions for you.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Mr. Efron. We appreciate your testimony. I think what we'll do now is we'll recess for a break. We'll resume around 5:12, at which point we will move ahead with staff witnesses. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you. We're off the record.
Alrighty then.
Yep.
All right, we'll go back on the record. As a preliminary matter, I'm prepared to rule on the admission of the commission exhibits. Are there any objections to their admission?
No, Your Honor.
No.
All right, they are admitted. And Mr. Dean?
Thank you, Your Honor. Staff would like to call Mr. Philip E. Vanderhayden to the stand. Mr. Vanderhayden, could you state your position here at the Commission?
I am the Assistant Executive Director.
Thank you. Do you have before you a document entitled The Direct Testimony and Exhibits of Philip E. Vanderhayden, dated November 20, 2018, consisting of 42 pages of testimony and exhibits?
I do.
Was this document prepared by you or under your supervision?
It was.
Do you have any changes or corrections to this document?
I do not.
Thank you. Staff would like to mark this as Staff Exhibit number 26.
So marked.
Do you also have a document entitled The Sir Rebuttal Testimony of Philip E. Vanderhayden, consisting of 28 pages of testimony and one exhibit, dated January 16, 2019?
I do.
Was this document prepared by you or under your supervision?
It was.
Do you have any changes or corrections to this document?
I do not.
Your Honor, staff would like to mark this as Staff Exhibit number 27,
So marked.
and staff would like to move these two documents into the administrative record.
Hearing no objections, they are admitted.
Mr. Vanderhayden, do these two documents constitute your testimony for this proceeding?
They do.
Thank you. Your Honor, the witness is available for cross-examination.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Honor. Hi, Mr. Vanderhayden. Please
Morning.
turn to page 25 of your direct testimony.
I'm there.
You include a chart here reflecting your calculation for rate of return, correct?
Yes,
And am I correct that you revised this chart as part of your Sir Rebuttal testimony?
I did.
Please turn to page 28 of your Sir Rebuttal testimony.
I'm there.
You state that you revised this chart based on the revised capital structure identified in Mr. Dupre's supplemental direct testimony. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And specifically, you indicate that this chart was modified to reflect a small shift in the percentage of debt to equity of 0.01%, correct?
That's correct. There's also a change to the long-term debt. I think it is correct at 4.335.
Okay. It's not clear to me. I believe in your direct testimony, you indicated a long-term cost rate of long-term debt of 3.91%. Was that simply a typo?
I believe it was. It's been updated in this chart.
Okay, thank you. And did the change to the 4.335% cost rate for long-term debt also change the weighted average cost of long-term debt?
It would have, yes.
And did that also change your proposed rate of return to 6.93%?
Correct.
Thank you. Could you please turn to page 40 of your direct testimony?
I'm there.
Is it your position that a business risk adjustment should not be applied as part of Potomac Edison's return on equity calculation?
Yes.
And I believe on page 40 of your direct testimony, I'm at lines 22, 23, and continuing on to page 41, you state that this is your position because of a prior case in which the Commission described PEPCO's service territory in Maryland as economically stable and located in a jurisdiction that allowed utility-friendly policies. Is that correct?
Yes.
But wouldn't you agree that Potomac Edison's and PEPCO's service territories are pretty different in terms of size, credit ratings, customer amount?
Yes.
You'd agree that Potomac Edison is considered a smaller utility than Pepco, correct?
Yes,
And do you know if Potomac Edison has fewer customers than Pepco?
it does.
Does Potomac Edison have a smaller rate base than Pepco?
I believe it would.
And also, Pepco has a number of different tariff provisions from Potomac Edison and different cost recovery mechanisms.
I don't know that I've compared them, but I would assume that aside from the general embedded cost rate making, that there are differences within their tariffs.
Thank you. And then in terms of Pepco's financial situation, that would also be different from Potomac Edison's, correct?
Could you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. You participated in Pepco's most recent base rate case, correct?
I did.
Do you happen to know what Pepco's current credit ratings are for Moody's, S&P, and Fitch?
I don't know. I believe they are investment grade.
Okay. Subject to check, would you agree that Pepco's current credit ratings are A2 for Moody's, A for S&P, and A- for Fitch?
Subject to check.
And do you know if Pepco has higher or lower credit ratings for Moody's, S&P, and Fitch than Potomac Edison?
I don't know.
Do you have Mr. DeSantis' direct testimony in front of you?
I do.
Please turn to page 44 of his direct testimony.
I'm there.
Here I'm at lines, it's the final answer on page 44. Mr. DeSantis states that PE's long-term issuer rating is Baa2, while the average long-term issuer rating of his utility proxy group is A3. Is that correct?
Yes.
And to your knowledge, is an A3 credit rating considered more favorable than a Baa2 credit rating?
Yes.
And could lower credit ratings create additional financial risk for a utility?
Please explain what you mean by financial ratings.
Don't you agree that a lower credit rating is a signal that might discourage investment?
By an equity investor, you mean?
Yes.
I don't know that there is any information that I have that would tell me that an investor in a utility stock, that when comparing two stocks that are investment grade, would significantly expect a return on the equity to be different.
Okay.
In other words, there's not a lot of information that I'm aware of that would say that an investor who's looking at two different utilities that have different but investment grade ratings would be having an expectation of a return to be higher for the one with the lower credit rating.
Okay. Well, all else being equal between two companies, wouldn't the company with a lower credit rating be less attractive to investors?
Well, not necessarily. The credit rating is reflecting the return or the risk of the debt, which is not the same as the risk on the equity. So there could be other things that make a particular stock more attractive, even though it had a lower credit rating.
Okay, fair enough. Please turn to your exhibit PEV2.
I'm there?
This is a list of all of your proxy group members, correct?
It is.
And the last column of this chart is titled Financial Strength Rating. Is this the financial rating assigned by Value Line?
It is.
And what is Potomac Edison's Value Line Financial Strength Rating?
Potomac Edison isn't rated by Value Line. I think First Energy is.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Harrell. Mr. O'Loughlin.
No cross-examination.
Mr. Dean.
Staff has no redirect. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, well, I guess it's afternoon. Good afternoon, Mr. Vanderheyden.
Good morning.
Thank you for your testimony. Would you say generally that with respect to return on equity that gas companies usually have a higher or lower risk or ROE than electric companies?
So based on the recorded returns in like the I guess regulatory research reports of that nature, I think gas companies tend to have higher ROEs awarded.
Higher ROEs awarded?
Yes.
Okay. So on page 7, I think it's of your direct testimony. Let's see. Maybe not. Maybe it's your sir rebuttal. Let me, I didn't label it in my notes. Perhaps not. I thought in your testimony you stated that an increase in ROE above that of a previous determination for a company would require a demonstration of need for higher returns. Did you say that?
That sounds familiar.
Okay. I thought it was on page 7, but I didn't see it directly. So is the converse true? Would a decrease in, is the converse true? Would you have demonstrated lower returns to decrease the ROE?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. So you also cite in your testimony to gradualism and it's important to follow precedent, make gradual changes, and not surprise investors, right?
Yes.
So do you think your ROE recommendation meets those suggestions of gradualism and not surprising investors?
I would say that it does.
Mm-hmm.
At 925, it's lower by 25 basis points than the 9.5 that electric utilities have been earning recently.
Mm-hmm.
I think the last time the Commission made an adjustment relative to gradualism was in a Delmarva case, where there was an adjustment downward from 8.6 to 9.6, where the public utility law judge had a lower number, but the Commission increased it, and they cited gradualism. So roughly somewhere around 20 basis points, I think, was what the Commission at the time had considered to be still gradual. I would also say when I'm developing a number, I'm considering how it reflects the more recent testimony that I've written, and I believe in 2017, I had testimony that developed ROEs around 9.35. So it was a little bit lower than that, and I think I understand why it had moved lower. And it's also, fairly close to some of the national averages that were reported by the SNL publication that I had cited,
Mm-hmm.
which were for distribution only. On the order of, on the low end, 9.3, and on the high end in the upper 9s.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the average awarded return for distribution-only electric companies has been declining. I think it came up a little bit in 2017, then it appeared to decline again. But those averages are, you have to take them as for what they are. They don't obviously cover every utility. It's only the ones that have been awarded cases or awarded rates in the last few years or so.
Right.
So I think I wouldn't say 925 is outside the range of where other commissions have made awards. I think I noted in there was a Minnesota case that was actually a little bit lower. So I don't to answer your question, I don't think it surprises investors at that level.
Right. Even though the current return is 11.9.
The current return, the current awarded return being significantly far back in time,
Right.
is probably not something investors would be considering. I think the attached to witness Purcell is the DR we ask about what the company's returns have been, and those have been as high as 13% about 5 years ago, working their way down through 10, and perhaps to 8.5 or so last year, to maybe 5 or so for the test year.
Right.
So, looking at a rate from what at the time had been a much higher, I think the dividend yield was probably like 7% back then. I looked at that order from 1994, perhaps, I think it was. I forget the name of the case specifically. The company had asked for something like in the 12% range. So I think investors are not expecting that the commission would look at an order from that far back in the past. They're probably expecting the returns to be granted similar to what the commission has been granting in recent cases.
Right, and I guess that there's been some suggestion that it's possible that if we were to accept a recommendation at 925, which is the staff's recommendation, that could cause the company some difficulty in terms of its credit rating or other issues with investors, because it is lower than what the commission has been granting with respect to other electric companies in recent times.
It's possible. I think it would still involve an increase on the order of maybe $10 million. So it wouldn't be a decrease. That certainly might rattle investors if they saw the commission make decreases to revenue. But even at that level, although, and again, please understand that when I make this recommendation, I'm attempting to provide some consistency between the staff recommendations that I've made in the last few years, so that you have something to just sort of compare it with. I think there is a range there. The DCF number was up at 951, and then the CAPM number came down closer to 9. So it's kind of the average of those two. So I assume that as what the commission has typically done when reviewing the testimony of not only staff but other witnesses is looking for a range there. And certainly the high end of the range using the DCF would be a reasonable number, and perhaps the low end of the range would get towards the range where like SNL would find the regulatory environment to be unhelpful, perhaps. I think there have even Value Line mentions that when commissions make awards down around 9%, as some have, that's not a constructive regulatory environment of some kind.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Vanderhaden. Commissioner Richard?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Just looking at your testimony, I think there's a chart, and I was just looking for it, but it lays out what the most recent commission orders have been with regards to ROE, and it looks like the most recent have been, I think you just stated, in the 9.5, 9.6 range. Can you just give me just a summary of why we should be looking at something at 9.25, which is fairly significantly lower than the most recent commission decisions on the other two? Can you just quick summary of what's different about PE, circumstances, and any other factors that support that recommendation?
Certainly. The development of the return for my testimony uses the DCF and a CAPM, and I average the two together. The reason that DCF, and to address, I would say there is not as much of there is not an element in my analysis that evaluates Potomac Edison significantly differently than other distribution utilities in Maryland. So the approach I used in this case, and the approach I used in the Delmarva case previously, and the Pepco case, all used the same approach. So I am not making a specific adjustment for Potomac Edison due to their size or the time it's been since their last case or anything else. Had I made a recommendation for Potomac Edison, or for Pepco, for Delmarva, or even BG&E, it's likely to have been similar. The DCF number is a little bit higher than the last time, and I think that had to do with the determination of the dividend yield. and that's because I used 180 days of trading, 126 trading days, about 6 months of calendar time prior to the company filing the case in August. During that time, I believe the utility stocks probably dropped a little bit, and that may have brought the dividend yield upward. I think the growth metrics for the earnings, which I use as the growth component of the DCF calculation, I think it's more or less the same. There may have been some small increases. So I think relative to just some changes in what happened in the market, the DCF number is more or less the same. The CAPM number is significantly low. Well, so it's perhaps 50 or 60 basis points lower than it had been previously, and I think that's coming from two things. Number one, the beta calculation was about 10 basis points lower, and that the beta is the relative risk of, in this case, the group of the utility stocks relative to the 2,800 stocks in the New York Stock Exchange that they use, that say Value Line's using for their calculation of beta. So that's a historic number as well, and so that number has declined. That's kind of almost a mechanical arithmetic change because they use rolling averages that go back about 5 years, I think. So somehow in the year or so, they're picking up more recent data and dropping off older data, and in that time frame, the betas essentially decreased from around 0.7 down closer to 0.6. So that took the CAPM result down. The other half of the CAPM is the risk-free rate, and that is essentially following the predictions. In this case, we derive that from IHS Markit, which is a large company that provides financial information. Their prediction on the 30-year Treasury bonds has actually declined since last year, and I think that had to do with the understanding that as the federal funds rate was raised by the Fed, there was not an identical and corresponding increase in the 30-year Treasuries that how the market was valuing them. So last year there was perhaps an expectation there would be higher long-term bond rates than what are happening right now, and so I don't know precisely how they make all of their determinations, although they explain it a little bit in the pages of the publication where they provide that estimate. They're basically seeing long-term rates not being as high as they had thought they were last year. So when we look at that 5-year projection for the long-term rates, that has also come down. So between those two adjustments, the CAPM number has come down. Conversely, the DCF number came up a little bit, I believe, from last time. And so I think what I'm trying to do by using a similar proxy group and not making specific adjustments with for each type of company, I'm giving you something that you can look at when you're considering the rate of return that shows how that's changing over time.
Great. Thank you. I guess the other question I had is, as you know, the company is requesting a risk adder, both for the size of the company, also for the investment rate, grade, and then also flotation cost. To your knowledge, or in your studies, do other commissions consider those types of adders in their decisions?
I don't know specifically. There's often not, when you look through commission orders, you don't often get a specific mention of methods or specific adjustments. So I can't tell you if I don't recall reviewing an order where the flotation was specific, other than what I've cited in the testimony. So, and as for business risk adjustments, I think those are not an easy thing to make, and so commissions have perhaps difficulty citing a specific adjustment for that. I think, like for example, this commission for some time had an adjustment for the BSA calculations, and then they kind of moved away from that. So it's difficult, I think, to say we should adjust 25 basis points for business risk, because when you're going through the process of a case, coming up with evidence that would allow you to precisely calculate it at that level becomes difficult. So I think what you end up doing as making that decision is you decide where within your range. If you believe there's a higher business risk, you might move slightly higher in the range that you're granting.
Okay. And is it possible that some of this would already be picked up when you do your analysis of your proxy groups? That if some of these factors were in their ROEs, that they would again automatically just be there when you analyze your proxies?
Certainly, when one of the features of using a proxy group and the different methodologies, with the CAPM, your beta is measuring the movement of the individual stock to the rest of the market. One has the underlying assumption there that folks who are out buying and selling stocks are equally making a decision. For every seller, there's a buyer. So there's an assumption that the buyers know what they're doing, the sellers know what they're doing. They're deciding how much they want to pay for a stock, and that assumes that they know the information that's out there. And if commissions are posting their awards in orders that can be read by investors and the public, so those stock prices and the movements in those stock prices are influenced by all that knowledge out in the public. So making an adjustment specific to a proxy group would require you to say, well, here's a company that is somehow not, that their information's not public. Like a small company, if it were privately held, they wouldn't be reporting lots of things, so you can't always see what they're doing. When you have a regulated utility and they follow the FERC system of accounts and they have rate cases, and they make their FERC 1 filing, you can see all of the information. You know how much rate base, you know what their earnings, their sales. There's a lot of information about public utilities out there, so investors can take all of that into their own determinations and decide how much they want to buy or sell for. So with the CAPM, you're looking at the price movement, and that assumes the public and the investing public knows what's going on. You look at the DCF, you're looking at that's a decision made on buying or selling a stock based on the dividend yield it's providing.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Looks like this is the last round. I'm going to ask you a series of rapid fire kind of questions, yes or no.
Okay.
Okay. And then I'll ask you the money question attached to those. So Mr. DeSantis does his calculation and comes up with a preliminary recommendation of 10.1% ROE, and then he does, as Commissioner Richard alluded to, three adders or adjustments post-determination, which is 30 basis points for business risk and 27 basis points for finance risk and 12 basis points for flotation costs. You recommend against all three, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So if you go to, now we're done with the rapid fire round. We'll go to page 42 of your testimony. And you summarize your conclusions. Of those three post-determination adjustments of Mr. DeSantis, you only list the flotation costs. Is that an indication that that one is more important to deny than the other two?
No, although I would note that the Commission has specifically addressed flotation in orders before, so that's probably why I was citing it there.
We've denied them most recently, right?
Unless there's actual flotation costs within, I believe, a 10-year period going backward, or some evidence, although it's always been historic data about flotation costs.
Okay. I just want to make sure that this particular adjustment didn't have a higher value in your mind than the other two. You think equally we should deny all three for different reasons, probably.
Yes.
Okay, very good. Thank you. That's all I had. Thanks for your testimony.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Donnell. Mr. Vanderhooyden, again, thank you very much for your testimony. I believe that concludes all of our witnesses. Are there any other matters that any party has to bring before us?
No, Your Honor.
Seeing none, I understand our schedule calls for briefs due on February 13th and reply briefs on the 27th. Having no other business, we will adjourn. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.